Hello, everybody. Welcome to the end of Republica almost. And thank you for being here. And thank you to Republica for having me here. As Max said, I want to talk about this age of empire that we're in and the movement that I certainly think I am a part of, Mozilla is a part of, hope you are a part of, really to create a balance and bring back the internet that as it really was meant to be, as a decentralized system owned by all of us. And so let's see if the clicker works. When Sandra and Geraldine asked me to talk, I was in the middle of rereading a book called Empire and Communications by a Canadian scholar, Harold Innis, who was actually an inspiration for Marshall McLuhan. And his idea really was the technology we use to communicate is central in the empires that emerge. And so that just kind of got me into this theme and kicked me off on sort of how to think about the empires we have today and how we make the internet ours again. And so I'm going to talk about that in three parts. One is I'm going to talk about the digital empires that have emerged in the last 20 years. I'm going to also talk about the role that social movements play in providing a counterbalance to the consolidation of power, and really look at the environmental movement as an example of that I think we can learn from. And then I want to talk about our movement, or certainly, again, the movement I feel part of that grew out of free software, but really is about the digital world being something in our control, and the control of everybody who lives inside of it, which increasingly is everyone. And in particular, I want to make one argument throughout this piece, and this is where I'm spending all of my time and significant amount of Mozilla's resources right now, is I want to argue that we want to make the health of the internet a mainstream social issue that everybody understands is something we need to focus on. And in doing that, not only that we need to think about it from a government and a policy perspective, but as Lawrence Lessig once talked about, that we look at that from the perspective of laws and social norms and markets and code that reflect those values of decentralization, of openness that the internet was built on. So hopefully I will convince you all of that. This is a stupidly ambitious talk, so if I get lost or get confused, try to clap and wake me up and encourage me to kind of move on. Because it's sort of a journey to make an argument that's a little bit new for us and for me, but is central actually to where Mozilla wants to go and hopes that you will come alongside of us. So here we go. First, this idea of empire. And what I'm going to do at the beginning of each section, I'm Canadian. You're going to get a black and white picture of a famous Canadian or a not so famous Canadian. So this is Harold Innis in a canoe, I don't know when, probably the 30s. And he was a political economy professor at the University of Toronto. And as I said, he made this connection between how communications work and how empires formed and consolidated power. And the quote here is that the sword and the pen, in the case of the Roman Empire, worked together. That the power was increased by consolidating in a few hands, and the writing in particular was central to that. And so if we take a little look at the map of the Roman Empire, at one level it's probably something you saw in history class and looks fairly familiar. But what that actually was many villages and towns and cities and kingdoms that over the course of decades and centuries were consolidated into a single thing with one central source of power. And the Greeks never expanded their power that far, or any other empire, the Egyptians before the Romans, in part because they actually didn't have the advanced communication systems that were developed both with paper, of course the Egyptians had paper, but also with literacy, not just amongst scholars, but actually amongst the military. And so you're able to actually take all of these independent forces or kind of cultures, cities, villages, towns, kingdoms, as I say, and roll them into one. And obviously, that might be good if you're Caesar, but it's not very good if you're somebody whose village or town or kingdom has been rolled into the empire. Although there are benefits, there's roads, there's just not freedom. Of course, the map of the internet, at least the one that I have in my head, looks very different than that map of Rome. This is a map of internet service providers, all the internet service providers on the internet in 1999. And it looks very much, like a fractal sort of expression where every bit of it really is equal to every other bit of it. And that to me is the thing about the internet that I love and I think is potentially empowering, has been dramatically empowering, but is not necessarily inherently there without caretaking, is this map of the internet as a decentralized system. And in that system, this is actually quite embarrassingly my first web page. I thought that cows instead of cats would become the currency of the internet, and I was wrong. But this was my first website, and it kind of was like my little village, and that was what, in the mid-90s, the internet was. Us all carving out our own space, homesteading, and everybody really who had an idea and could figure out how to code up a web page, really being able to kind of set up their own little village. And of course, I still, as probably everybody else here, have a presence on the internet, have many presences on the internet. But the one that's most common that I use a lot looks a lot like this. And despite my incredibly bad design skills, I think this is actually uglier. And so this is my Facebook page. Somehow Facebook thinks I'm interested in World Naked Gardening Day, and that I'm going to vote for the Ontario Liberal Party. But it's a big shift in the map of the internet, where we move from our own homesteading, our own villages, to really effectively being inside, for most people's self-expression, a set of walled gardens. And you could easily argue, well, so what? More people can express themselves, there's more creativity, and in some ways, that's true. And maybe I'm just being romantic about my first web page, but I feel there's something lost in that. But maybe more important is how have the maps changed in terms of power, from that first internet map to the moment we are now in terms of empire. And I think one place to look at it is to look at what's happened with smartphones and the app economy. How many people here have smartphones? Just to do a small poll. Right. How many people had smartphones 10 years ago? Right. So, the whole, and I might have also, it's kind of just around then. And, the whole way that we access the internet has shifted from the browser, from what I made that first web page probably in Netscape Composer, to the smartphone, which again is a huge source of creativity. But the power dynamics on the internet have shifted dramatically in the age of the smartphone. And one way to look at it is in the US, I'm Canadian, but I'll use the US example, Android is about 58% of the market. It's significant, but it's not a monopoly in that case. Although I don't know what the European percentages are in different European countries. As most people here will probably know, even at those sorts of levels, the EU is looking into, is Google practicing anti-competitive behavior in how it bundles things inside of Android. But really, if you actually look at other places where we're seeing more growth in smartphones, faster numbers of growth in emerging markets, you actually see a very different picture. Because the iPhone is irrelevant in a place like India. And effectively, Google is the only player in the market. And so in India, Android is 91% market share, very close to the 98% market share that Internet Explorer had and the kind of Windows in its heyday. And I actually often think of Android as the Windows 95 of the emerging economies or of the developing world. It is the only thing. Now, maybe that's not bad, although when we just had Windows, there were a lot of governments who were upset and got Microsoft to unbundle things and help give us choice. I certainly think that was the right thing for those governments to do. But the difference with Android in this situation is it really owns the whole stack. It owns everything from the operating system. Mostly it doesn't own the hardware. So from the hardware up to the identity system, to email, to distribution of all content through the Play Store. You can't get stuff easily on that device without actually going through Google. So you have a vertically integrated monopoly emerging, especially in places where they're really trying to build their digital economies for the first time. So that's a kind of an interesting challenge, and to me, hints at this kind of growing imperial power. Another way to look at it, we co-funded a report called Winners and Losers with a group, Caribou Digital, and they looked at basically trade flows in the app economy. So how is money flowing and even just usage flowing in smartphone apps? So these are the cities in the world where you see the most revenue generated from the app economy. And it's not showing it by scale. Really, Silicon Valley and China are the two places where really the money is. I mean, as most of you know, there aren't, other than Skype, that many huge global apps from a European context. So most of the money is flowing back to Silicon Valley and China. But then where is most of the use emerging and growing? The fastest growing smartphone markets are these ones. They're in none of the places the apps come from. So if you want to see the trade flow, you just go back and forth between these two slides. Come on, there we go. You know, it's kind of, you see something familiar there. And it looks to me a lot like this, which is a map of the British Empire. I could put any other European empire of the 18th or 19th century there. But the pattern here is that resources are extracted from poorer countries, in this case, the resources being eyeballs and people's attention and people's use of the internet. They're taken back to rich countries, they're processed, they're value added, and then they're shipped and sold back to those poorer countries. To me, that app economy trade flow really is a colonial trade flow. And when we look even further into that research that came out of Caribou, it is virtually impossible. I mean, we just don't, maybe it's not impossible. We do not see cases of people in the fastest growing smartphone markets breaking out with apps and internet businesses, barely even in their own economies, much less on a global scale. Incredibly hard to enter the market. So those are some of the factors that I start to think of as being this age of empire, which is really about consolidation of control. It's not that Google in particular around Android is evil or that Facebook is evil. It's that they really have gotten too much power on a medium that was designed to be decentralized, which in its humanizing and democratic potential is decentralized. So we have a problem of consolidation of power or something that actually we want to keep power distributed. One other interesting angle, just to kind of finish up this empire piece, is where do the citizens of the internet fit in? And how much do they know about what's going on and have agency? Because this is not an empire by pure force of will. We all use Facebook and Google and Apple tools because we like them. Some of us know how to opt out. Many people don't. Extreme version of that is ourselves, as well as a couple of other folks, in this case Quartz, started doing research with new smartphone users about 18 months ago. And one of the things that we found in our field research, we'd go up to somebody and say, do you use the internet on that smartphone? And they say, well, what's the internet? And we say, oh, well, what do you use it for? Do you use it just for telephone calls and text messages? Oh, no, I use it for Facebook. And in case after case, both in a set of African countries and in India and Bangladesh, found that people are extensively using Facebook and do not see that there is an internet beyond that. Again, maybe you think there's no crime in that, but to me, the beauty of the internet is all of the infinite things you can find in it. And to think that you have an internet that you can't see beyond one website, to me, is not the internet I want to build in the future. And as Facebook rolls out Free Basics, which is basically a free access to Facebook and 5 or 10 or 20 other websites for poor people, we get to a place where the internet is very different for the poor than the rich in those countries. And that empire of imagination, the ability to only see a very narrow field of view, is something that actually gets baked into society. So you may be sitting here thinking, who cares, Mark, whatever, empires. I certainly think there is a shift in power on the internet that is dramatic that we need to pay attention to. What was interesting, how many people saw the cover of The Economist with Zuckerberg on it 2 weeks ago? Is anybody here? A very tiny number of people. So for those of you who didn't, this is what it was. And so The Economist also thinks that Zuckerberg has imperial ambitions, as the headline goes, but we are in this age of empire. And in the Economist case, really, they talk about the empires battling it out, Google and Apple and Amazon and Facebook. For me, I'm actually interested in how do we as citizens have a voice in where all this goes, so it's not just about those empires dividing up the spoils. So that's what I want to talk about next. So let's accept that Zuckerberg wants to be on that chair, and maybe it's not even bad, or he's not badly motivated, but to me that's too much power, and it's not the internet I want. So if we want to stand up to that or shift that, my belief, as I said at the beginning, is we really need to make the health of the internet, and by the health of the internet, I particularly mean the internet as a decentralized force that anyone can do anything on without permission being asked from others, that's free of censorship, and is there for all of us to share. And that was the internet we started with. Maybe it was a blip in time. I don't believe it is or has to be. But I do believe that the health of the internet as a decentralized and open system has to be a mainstream issue that everyone in our society cares about, stands for, that we kind of take for granted as almost a right, but certainly as a resource we all share and need to protect if we want that internet to exist in the future. So that's a kind of daunting task. There are these gazillion-dollar corporations who are effectively like governments, colonizing the world. And I'm saying, and I think many of us here are saying, we actually want to limit their power and re-decentralize the internet. So how do you kind of take on that daunting task if you're not competing with them purely as a company? Although we do at Mozilla, we also compete in that way. And what I started to do is think about the challenge of making the health of the planet a mainstream issue, which has had some success over the last 100 years, and what can we learn from that? And before I go into that, maybe just one quiz. How many people would sort of consider themselves environmentalists or kind of support the environmental movement just in the audience? There's a kind of low number for Germany. Maybe people's arms are... Keep your hands up just for a second. And how many people think that at your age, your parents would have said the same thing? Just keep your hands up. It's a much smaller number. How about your grandparents? So in 3 generations, the environment, whatever side of climate change you're on, whatever side of environmental issues you're on, has moved from being something that we all agree is a mainstream social issue of social import, worthy of discussion, worthy of debate. It doesn't mean we're always winning or that we have won, but it is something that is legitimately, like the economy, like education, something that we can debate and try to balance power and make decisions on as a society. So, how did that happen? How did the health of the planet become a mainstream issue? And here I have another black and white picture of a Canadian. This is Tzipora Berman, who I was a fan of since I first saw her introduce Ralph Nader 30 years ago. So a very important global climate change campaigner for Greenpeace. Now she's doing sort of more strategy and writing stuff. And it's not the most elegant quote, but it gets to what I think is really important about the modern success of the environmental movement and something that Tzipora is standing for, which is if you're going to protest, you also have to talk to all the players and work out solutions. And really that means you can't just protest, you also have to deal with markets, you also have to deal with norms. Not so much are they talking about code. So, that's important to think about through this history, because we started 150 years ago as the Industrial Revolution is, taking off like wildfire, where, we could have had a far worse planet than we have. I mean, we have a very shitty planet, but, it was not going in a good direction, and certainly there was going to be a need to mitigate. And really early on, and I tell this a little bit from the North American perspective of environmental movement history, because that's what I know. From early on, you have people like Thoreau, in this case sitting in a cabin in the woods, talking about the value of nature. You've got other people who are talking about growing industrialization and trying to limit it in Europe. So from really the late 19th century, you have the seeds of an environmental movement saying, we actually have to think consciously about this relationship between humans and the planet, industry and nature. And that conversation actually starts in a way that we probably don't, for most of us, think of as the environmental movement. But that is really the seeds of it if you look at environmental historians. Now, of course, what's going on as Thoreau is in his cabin is not particularly pretty. The cities are building factories, and we're starting to clear-cut North America. And you see the nice paper mills in the background. I grew up in one of those towns. So it still looks like that in the 80s. And so what's happening, even as people are thinking about the environment, to really starting to kind of pillage, especially North America, for natural resources in a way it would be hard to come back from. And what's interesting is, how pixelated is that? It's very pixelated. What's interesting is you actually start to get your first environmental activists in the late 1800s in North America. And this is John Muir on the right, who's the founder of the Sierra Club with Teddy Roosevelt. And the Sierra Club is basically a club of campers, kind of like the maker movement, right? People like to get together and do stuff related to the thing they care about. But who also, one of their great successes is from very early on in the turn of the century, basically, with Theodore Roosevelt, founded Yosemite National Park and really built the foundations of the American national park system. So it's kind of interesting that quite early in environmental activism in America, you have a meaningful connection between citizen action, citizen use of the land, and government, doing something that's meaningful that I believe is an important and meaningful environmental legacy and grows into the conservation movement more broadly, not just into national parks. So from early on, you have a movement that has an impact that is very clear and concrete. That doesn't stop the fact that we're still wrecking the planet, that we're still building chemical plants, that we're building nuclear plants, that we're paving the suburbs of North America, that around the world we're really not treating the planet well. And what's interesting, in this kind of inflection point, sort of after the war in North America, is not only were we pillaging the earth, but we were advertising how awesome it was. And so this is a real ad, I think from the 50s, about the benefits of DDT. The other ad I could have chosen was about how great DDT was for your children, but it wasn't the right resolution. So we're in a moment where we're just not paying attention to this stuff, and there isn't an environmental movement paying attention to this piece of it. I mean, you've got the Sierra Club, and you have conservationists, but you don't have the modern environmental movement yet. And so there's some wins in conservation, but still a huge challenge and losses in the general treatment of the planet. Oops. And so a real turning point is in the 62, the early 60s. Rachel Carson comes out with a book called Silent Spring, specifically talking about DDT and other toxins in a way that the industry is just not wanting to have the public know about. And that becomes an inflection point where really companies become untrusted by the public in relationship to the environment. So the modern environmental movement where companies are actually the focus of a lot of the activism as much as the government, and the government really being actually a policy intervening, it's really citizens against companies, is really sparked with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. So you see a next wave emerging. You see Greenpeace and dozens of other organizations starting out in a kind of new kind of activism, and a kind of activism that's global, as well as creative and in many cases effective. You see ministers of environment and other things start to emerge. I mean, before the 60s, I've never gone back and totally checked, but I'm pretty sure there is no government on the planet who had a minister of the environment. We didn't have the global summits on the environment that we have had since. And we can question how successful those things are, but really from the 60s, this became a legitimate part of our discourse about power and resources and control in our society. That was not the case for our grandparents. We just saw that. That was not the case before Rachel Carson. So there is a meaningful shift that happens from the 60s to the 80s and into the 90s. And really, Western consumerism in both Europe and North America, the environment becomes a core part of the discourse, almost where things like recycling are your duty as a citizen. Very boring, but a huge shift in public consciousness and norms. huge shift in public consciousness and norms. And even to the point where, of course, companies, and you can be cynical about this as well, really create products that are not only marketed as environmental, but in many ways, over the long term, are. And what's interesting about this Toyota ad, if you can read it, is that the Sierra Club is one of the people who's given Toyota an award for the Prius. Again, easy to be cynical, but a real shift in discourse. A real shift in discourse isn't victory, but it is essential to actually pursue the aims you have, and was not possible with the environment, 2 decades, 3 decades before this ad was published. And we're now at a spot where the planet is under threat. It's getting hotter, but we actually are in a spot where we can pursue solutions. And I think certainly without that public discourse, without the environmental movement, we would be accelerating at a much faster pace. So small victories, but I think actually huge, to imagine that norms and markets and laws have changed so dramatically, really especially in the post-war period, to let us think about protecting the health of the planet. So there's still much work to do, but the health of the planet is a mainstream issue almost everywhere. So, what if we want to do that for the internet? I believe we have to, and that is urgent, and that is political. So, what does that look like? What is our movement, as I would define it, and invite you to think about it? And what's the state of it, and where do we need to go? So let me just go through that piece briefly. Last Canadian, which is a bit of a cheat because he moved to Canada, is William Gibson, who famously said, "The future is here, just not evenly distributed." And certainly I see part of our job is to keep it distributed, both in a decentralized way and from a perspective of equity and power. Now, one might, if we were looking for our Walden Pond, and it's not a perfect example because it's from a Republican Grateful Dead lyricist, look back to the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace that John Perry Barlow wrote in 93 or 94. And it is as poetic, well, maybe not as poetic, certainly as naive and as disconnected from what's going on around him as Thoreau is, where he says, "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, we come from cyberspace, blah, 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 leave us alone." And, that was a great sentiment at the time. I certainly had been online for a few years by then, loved that, felt great, like you can't fuck with us. But of course, as that's happening, the empires are already emerging. And they're actually emerging enough that governments are paying attention. And if you can't tell, this is Bill Gates in '98 at his antitrust trial for bundling the browser with the operating system, which ultimately, combined with Mozilla having some impact on some other things, really takes them from being an empire to just a big company, which is fine with me. So, as this is going on, as the Microsoft empire is in its full swing, a movement is forming, the movement that I see myself as a part of. And Mozilla actually sort of formed in that milieu. And you may not know, Mozilla has sort of two hats. We're a nonprofit and we're a player in the market, a company. And we really were formed with this super idealistic vision. This is from our incorporation papers, which I've had to read over and over and over again as I've dealt with IRS tax audits. And it says, Mozilla exists to guard the open nature of the internet. So that's why we started. And of course, other people at that time also felt the same thing. We need to counterbalance that empire. The internet, software, computers should be forces of freedom and democracy and the people. And we don't actually just need to, we don't need to stand up and protest to make that happen or use antitrust trials, although those are helpful in creating openings. We need to make shit. And that's where open source and free software had a real advantage and a really special fervor, because it was a movement of people who had a cause, but actually could build a part of the world they wanted, at least for that time. And so, what happens in through the late 90s and into the early 2000s is that movement starts to actually build the world that it dreams of. So this is early Wikipedia, I guess 2001. Wikipedia is still the 10th or 11th biggest website on the planet. and is effectively a free software project and would certainly see themselves that way. It has a global grassroots community. So that's a pretty astounding thing early on. Maybe it's like the Sierra Club getting Yosemite. It's a big thing. It lasts for a long time. Let's see later in the story if it's enough. And then, same thing happens with Firefox. This is the famous Firefox New York Times ad in 2004 when Firefox 1 comes out, probably the first crowd-funded ad and really kind of early crowdfunding project, where separate from Mozilla, thousands and thousands of people donate to buy a 2-page Sunday New York Times ad to announce Firefox to the world and say to Microsoft, you're in for a fight. And of course, like Wikipedia, that goes well. The blue part being where the pure open source Mozilla suite barely really gains any users, and then as Firefox comes out, it just skyrockets, which gives us, and us, not just Mozilla, I mean the free software movement, I mean people who stand for an open internet, a tremendous tool to take back power from Microsoft, who was running in its own direction with web standards and the web, and re-democratize it, introduce AJAX, introduce real web applications. All of those things become possible because we fragment the power of the empire in a genuine and tremendously effective way. Because they did, as they had 98% market share with Internet Explorer, have full control, and were taking the internet in a bad direction, in their direction, in one that wasn't about standards. And we and others changed that. So that was awesome. But that doesn't, with Mark Zuckerberg on the cover of The Economist, feel like where we are now. And I love this XKCD cartoon. I'll stop and let you read it, or read it yourself, which is, remember when we prosecuted Microsoft for bundling a browser with an OS? Imagine the future we live in if we'd been willing to let one tech company amass that much power. And then the woman says, thank God we nipped that in the bud. We're back in that spot. We're not just back in that spot with the browser, although we are. It's no surprise to anyone that both Firefox, and this is 2013, so it's actually worse now, Firefox and Internet Explorer have gone down in their market share, and Chrome has gone up. On one level, that's fine. It's competition, although Google's brutal use of advertising certainly is tough for us to compete with. But it moves into a place where the vertically integrated browser that, if you're logged in, completely tracks you and ties you back to everything else, is becoming the mainstream way on the desktop of browsing the web. And the privacy-oriented browser that doesn't make you log in, and even if you do use our private account system, doesn't give your data back to Google or Facebook or whoever else it is that you're interacting with, that's declining. It's both a shift in power towards the monopolies and the empires, and also a decline in an independent choice. And I would still argue, this is the only promotional plug I will make, that using Firefox is still a political act and is still worth doing for that reason. It's a good browser, but it actually is important to sustain independence on the internet. So, of course, we're figuring out what we do as Firefox declines. There's lots of things I can say about that in a separate talk, but here we're talking about the movement. And the other big win we had, the other big national park, is Wikipedia, which many people also have questions about. And in many ways, it's the same set of forces. How many people see sort of Wikipedia results in that Google sidebar right now to kind of get a summary? How many people have seen those? It's got to be most people, right? And if you're like me, you may not click through. You may get enough in that paragraph. You may know enough from that. That is dramatically eroding Wikipedia's native traffic, where by taking that open source asset and rolling it into the Google experience, which is great for us as users, as an open source commons, it actually becomes less and less relevant. So you have the two victories of the earliest phase of the movement, Firefox and Wikipedia, both a little shaky. Still strong, but shaky. And then you have the growth of these empires consolidating what is mainstream user experience every day. So, what do we do in that situation? How many people here have seen The Life of Brian? Excellent. So you'll remember the scene, but for those of you who won't, what does the movement do is what this question is. So what do? You keep trotting along with your movement. And if you remember the scene, they do exactly what we shouldn't do, is they walk into the Coliseum, and Brian, if you recall, has a crush on this girl, and she's sitting up there with another set of people, and he goes, "Oh, who's that?" And John Cleese says, "Oh, it's the People's Front of Judea." And he says, "Well, let's go talk to him." He goes, No. We're the Judean People's Front. And, then they start calling them names and so on. That's something that often happens as we stand to fight for the freedom of the internet. It's easy to say my version of net neutrality is better than your version of net neutrality. My browser or my open source thingy or my free software versus your open thing, my crypto versus your crypto, law versus code. It's easy for us to sit and nitpick and fight with each other and fight over names. And we do, and we look stupid and are getting our asses kicked as we do it. The thing we do in this situation is actually consolidate and look at each other as people in solidarity and as people who can build a future of a decentralized internet that has people in charge. So if you agree you want to do that, one of the things is actually to know ourselves. And we don't have to all think the same thing, but we actually do need to have the same opponents and the same objectives. And we're shitty at that, and we're not ambitious enough about it, and we don't spend enough time on it. So if I'm looking around, who I see as being a part of the movement, certainly is people who are protesting and standing up against bad laws, like in this case, I think it's an ACTA protest, which were victorious, and that's an awesome thing. And sometimes, you need to stand up and fight that way. But I think it's also a movement about building. And so, people who are out there teaching others to code, I see as a part of that movement. People who are out there trying to invent the next phase of IoT and hacking, as I see as a part of the movement. People in the maker movement, to me, even though they may be sort of a little bit seem apolitical to you and seem like they're just kind of tinkering with stuff, are very political and are very much a part of the movement. Journalists are part of the movement, as well as whistleblowers are also helpful. And even politicians are a part of the movement, and hopefully increasingly so. And so, if we think about that group, think that expansively, and think about more. Think about librarians. Think about people who are just afraid of their shit getting ripped off online as potentially part of the movement. So if we think expansively, we can actually get to the point where the health of the internet is a mainstream issue, and where we do have a chance to stand up to what has become a consolidation of power. I'm actually quite optimistic about it. But I'm only optimistic about it if we can take it on all these fronts, take the piece we're personally passionate about and run with it, but know that we have a broader goal and stop nitpicking each other and frankly, be more ambitious. Believe that like we have in the past, we can have an influence over where the internet goes. So if you want to do that, what are some of the things to do? Some of the things to do are still contribute to the open source projects that are the foundation of this movement, whether that's Firefox or Wikipedia or Linux. Really still critical. I'm now competing with a noise. But another piece of it is get involved politically, fight bad laws, or fight for good regulations, as here in the case of India, where a net neutrality law was, or a kind of an intervention was made to stop free basics. Or get involved in inventing the future of the Internet of Things in a way that is about hardware being open, data being private. This is a picture, as well as this prototype, from an open Internet of Things connected home workshop Mozilla hosted here in Berlin last weekend. And that's going to be a huge and critical part of what we need to build and think through in this movement. And then, really importantly, play in the market, as we also do, with our values. We need to be on all those fronts. We need to look at standing up and organizing as citizens for laws. We need to look at, actually I have to say one more thing. We need to build products, and we need to kind of get out there in all of the pieces of this. But one thing that really, to me, is actually most important and least done by this movement, and the environmental movement has been great at this, is shift norms and understanding. And that's why one of the things we've been doing over the last couple months is a mainstream public education campaign, much like the kind of public education campaigns with TV commercials you used to see around fitness, on encryption, because we want the public, everyone, to understand encryption is a part of everyday life, and as governments come to threaten it, it's actually something we value and should stand up for. So that's a piece on the norms. And I think if we can do that, we can build out, or we can protect, we can continue to grow an internet that is decentralized. And this to me is a nice image of that, although we want to fill in a lot of the blank spaces of all of the people or all the geolocated edits to Wikipedia, something that is made by all of us. And I still believe the internet we want, the internet we can have, can be made by all of us, but only if we fragment and decentralize power and put in balance and put in check the emerging empires. So just to conclude, 3 things to remember and an invitation to engage and come talk to me and work with Mozilla and work with each other. We really are in this moment of too much power in too few hands on the internet. I think understanding that, talking about it, and trying to decentralize it are critical right now. Because the people in question, their beloved consumer brands, as were the people who made DDT. And I'm not saying they're that evil, I'm saying they've got too much power and we need to counterbalance that. So thinking about that, reflecting on it, see how you think about it, and talking with people, critical. Organizing as a movement, whether that's as a maker and building things, or as somebody who's standing up against bad laws and stopping them, as in the case of this SOPA photo, absolutely getting engaged in the open internet, treating it as an issue, inviting other people to be involved is critical. And then that third piece is to really have a conversation about the multi-pronged nature of an open internet movement, that it is not just a protest movement, that it is not just a maker movement, that it is not just a code movement, it is not just a set of ethical businesses, it is not just an attempt to educate the public and shift new norms. It is and must be all of those things. And I believe if we can do that, we can take our issues and make them mainstream. It may sound very boring. Mainstream is a very boring word. But this is a moment where doing that, and when I talk about a moment, I mean the next year, the next 10 years, the next 30 years. This is a moment where doing that is very political, very urgent, very essential, or we are going to end up with a shopping mall for the internet, and the internet will organize and structure the power of all of human life. So if we want all of human life to be democratic, we want it to actually be something we control, this is something that we need to do, and I hope you'll do it together. It's certainly what I am putting all my time into right now, and a tremendous amount of Mozilla's resources is to help build this movement. So hopefully that's something we can work on together. Thanks. Did you want to do questions? We can do questions if you want. If you want to just moderate, I'll let people know.
So if there are any questions, just raise your hands. I think Mark will go on stage again.
And just let me know who you are.
Hi, I'm Karim. I would like to look on this issue from a customer perspective. So I just opened Google Maps, and it showed me when my flight is leaving today. And this gives a big user experience. So they have the data. But what I would do is sharing with you also the same data what Google and Facebook know. So I need an entity between me and the internet somehow, which is more democratic, because you need this data. And then it's not an asset which Google has. Because just working on the privacy, it's not the only solution. We need a solution which uses the data in the interest of the customer, maybe also financed by the customer and not by someone else.
So I think what you're saying, and not if you're right, because it's kind of breaking up, is if you want to actually liberate yourself or have privacy from Google and Facebook, but you get value from there being aggregate data, because it's predictive and all of that really awesome stuff, how can we do that? Is that sort of what you're asking? So I mean, certainly I think it's a good question. It's a right challenge. We've tried in a number of ways to take shots at that. Some of our early experiments in advertising, which is about actually leaving your data on your machine with your browser, which is actually a good way to aggregate your data because it's local and you control it, and then comparing some anonymized versions of that with other people's data. We didn't break through with that to provide the user value we wanted, but other people are trying to do similar things. So I think looking at the right balance of local data storage of your rich history combined with anonymized cloud information is an area that people are working, and you know, that's the kind of breakthroughs that are needed to get to that. And it is where that movement and the market piece come together, is we need companies that are activist about these topics and care about users who want privacy to be in the market commercially for that stuff to be real. It's important, and it is part of what we're working on.
So, any more questions? Perhaps? No, I think that's it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a great end of Republica. Go to the party.